Tonight we're going to be talking about, excuse me. Tonight we're going to be talking about setting the foundation and really understanding the context of how race and segregation and bias and all of those elements impact the reform efforts of schools. So particularly around the idea of when you are in an urban center and a part of an urban school, what does that mean? What is it that characterizes our urban school systems and our schools? What are the unique characteristics? What are the commonalities with other school systems? You know, maybe something that's more suburban or even rural. And then finally, how do we really get a handle on the context that our students are experiencing so that we can begin to make some really positive and proactive changes. So we're going to start off tonight by talking about specifically a study. This was a study that was done by Dr. Amanda Lewis. She's an associate professor of African American Studies and Sociology at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And not only did she do this study about, you know, what is race and why does it matter in our school systems, and about the persistence of racial inequality in our schools. So I'm going to share right now with you the PowerPoint presentation so that you can actually see what we're going to be talking about. Okay, maybe. Come on. There we go. Okay, so like I said, this is actually a study that was done by Dr. Lewis, and you know, we're sharing this with her permission. Okay. So let's talk for a second about race in the schoolyard. So this is actually a book that was published by Rutgers University Press, and written by Dr. Lewis and then Dr. John Diamond, who's also from the University of Chicago. And really some very interesting kinds of things that came out of this study that, you know, at least for me, were a little bit surprising. So here's the, oops, I'm sorry, I think I went too far. Maybe I didn't go far enough. There we go. So the whole premise was to really kind of look at the racial dynamics of a school and how it is that there are interactions and practices in school that either perpetuate racial issues or solve racial issues. So specifically, the idea of the study was to look at those practices and policies that contribute to or mitigate those racial inequalities that we see in our schools. And I've heard a lot of people say over the years, you know, well, I'm just colorblind. You know, I don't see, you know, whether you're black or you're white or you're Hispanic or you're Asian. This study basically comes up from the premise that colorblindness is not the answer. You know, we are all different. We all have different characteristics physically. We have different characteristics intellectually, etc. And that we can't be colorblind to people's differences, but we can embrace those differences and really create a system as well as a schooling experience that embraces all children and helps to push them to the highest levels of success. But let's start off and talk about the context and, you know, what are some of the realities that are found in our schools today. I'm sorry, this keeps going the wrong way for me. So one of the things that was studied by Dr. Lewis and Dr. Diamond was the GPA differences. And they looked at this over an almost 20-year period, so from 1990 to 2009. And this is based on data from 38,000 transcripts of 41,000 students and included 640 public and private schools across the U.S. So it's a really large sample, which is awesome, but also included both public and private schools. So you get a sense of where our students are falling. So this is broken down by race and ethnicity. So you will notice that the students who had from 1990 to 2009, the highest GPAs were our Asian or Pacific Islander students. Then you'll notice behind them were our white students. So Asian and Pacific Islander students in the year 2009, you know, obviously you know how to read a chart, had a 3.26 GPA upon average. Then our white students, theirs was 3.09. Our Hispanic students was 2.84, and our Black students was 2.69. So you'll notice there's a pretty substantial gap between our highest achieving students, which in this case happen to be the Asian Pacific Islander students, and our students who had much lower GPAs, which happen to be our Black students. So obviously something's going on. You know, if you think about just in terms of grade points, grade point averages and grading, you know, like I said, there is a very significant difference in their GPAs by the time that students graduate from high school. So the other part of this is there's always a lot, if you do any reading or research about race and ethnicity, there's really a lot of debate about it, you know, and some people will tell you that race is not real. It's not actually a biological or genetic category. It's just a way that we identify people and individuals. The only real thing is ethnicity. And if you look at some of the more recent, I don't know, if you're asked to fill out a survey or something like that, you know, a lot of them will not ask you about your ethnicity and whether you're Hispanic or you're not Hispanic. Whereas race is something that, particularly as our population grows and changes and morphs, you know, we have more and more students who would identify as multiracial. You know, how do you determine race? Is it based on the mother? Is it based on the father? You know, whatever. That it's not something that can be easily defined from a biological or genetic category. That race really is a social or political category that was founded and based in a historical construction. So why do we care about that? Why does that matter? Well, because we know that there's gaps in achievement between different racial groups. So we're going to explore a little bit more about that and hopefully get to some of the root causes. So history, unfortunately, you know, they say if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. But some of those things that came about, you know, back in the 1800s and even before that, still move forward or reverberate into our present situations. So let's talk about the historical context. So when people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Or you may have heard this saying that says, you know, perception is reality, whether we like it or not. So unfortunately, a lot of our cultural belief systems have been perpetuated over time. So, you know, if, you know, the society believed, you know, certain things about a particular race, that tends to be perpetuated over time historically. So let's talk about cultural belief systems. So one of the things that is a part of a cultural belief system is what would be called status beliefs. So, for example, this is what is a status belief? It's a widely shared cultural belief that people who belong to one social group are more esteemed and competent than those who belong to another social group. So, for example, some people tend to think that Asians are going to do really well in school, that they have a very high drive and motivation for school success, or that whites tend to be more affluent than maybe some other racial groups. Those are status beliefs. Whether or not they're grounded in fact is certainly up for debate, and sometimes is not supported by the research. I'll give you a very concrete example. So when I was a middle school principal in the Dallas School District, I had a very diverse school. We had students of all races, all ethnicities, you know, all socioeconomic levels. Like I said, a very diverse school. Well, we had a very high Asian population. And so a lot of people just assumed that my school was going to be tremendously successful because I had I'm so sorry, I've got hiccups, had a very significant Asian population of students. Well, in all honesty, because our Asian students came from very impoverished backgrounds, these were families who were oftentimes refugees. They had just come to the country. They didn't have any kind of skills or education or jobs or employment opportunities, etc. Those were actually our students we struggled with the most in terms of student achievement. So it bucked that stereotype that a lot of people have, or that status belief about Asians and their ability to achieve. So again, you know, sometimes those things we believe are not always grounded in fact. So not only do we have to worry about what is within those cultural belief systems, we also have to look at what resources groups have at their disposal, whether it's an economic resource, a social, or a cultural um, resource as well. I'm so sorry, I don't know why this keeps going backwards on me. So let's talk about some of the things that are happening right now. So race matters today, but it matters somewhat differently than it did, in previous generations. So racial dynamics today tend to be much more subtle and covert. You may have someone who absolutely hates a particular group of people, but they're not maybe as willing to say it as they were, say, back in the 1920s or 1930s, or to be a part of an identifiable group. As they maybe were historically. Also, too, racial hierarchies often appear to be really non-racial. So what do I mean by that? So within a particular group of individuals, you may have some that are of a higher economic status than others. And so sometimes the way that groupings happen, particularly in our schools, is not so much driven by race, but by socioeconomic status or access, those kinds of things. Because of this subtlety of dynamics that we see a lot of times in our schools and our systems, it is much harder oftentimes to identify really what's going on, and even more importantly, it's much harder to challenge and to come up with viable solutions. So let's talk about this particular project and the research that was done. So this was actually started with what's called the Suburban School Achievement Study, and they did a case study of Riverview High School. We don't know a lot more about it other than that's the name that they used. Now, we know Riverview was a racially diverse, affluent suburban high school. And obviously a fairly large school because they did over 200 interviews with students, teachers, administrators, staff, and parents. They also used in this study data from 40,000 6th through 12th grade students across 15 suburban school districts, which included Riverview. And they were looking at the community, social, historical, and economic data. So the intent behind this was to really see in a suburban type setting, I know we're talking about urban ed, but how racial inequality presents itself from multiple perspectives, okay? So let's talk about some of those theories that people have had for a long time regarding the achievement gap. So one of the theories is what's called oppositional cultural theory. So in this particular theory, they distinguish between two minority groups. One is voluntary, the other is involuntary. So if you think about traditional high school cliques, you may have some students who identify more with sort of the arts. So that may become a minority group, but they have volunteered to be a part of it. So if you've got 1,000 students in the school and there's 75 students who are really into the arts and theater and all of that, they are a minority of the students within the school system, but they volunteer to be a part of that group. Conversely, involuntary minorities, which would constitute Blacks, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, they recognize their position of structural inequality compared to the majority group or whites. So according to this theory, because these individuals are part of an involuntary minority group, they develop an oppositional orientation towards dominant institutions. So, in other words, in real English, you may have a group of students, let's say Mexican Americans, who, according to the theory, really rebel against institutions that they see as controlled by the majority or by the whites. So they will disengage from them and they will limit their effort to succeed in them. So this is one of the theories that was being tested. And this particular theory has been perpetuated, as you can see, since 1978. So Part of this hypothesis of this oppositional cultural bias is the burden of acting white. So you may have heard this before. So African American students who identify a school as a white institution often accuse their same race peers who strive to do well in school of acting white. So this theory says that you know, in the context of a school and a school system, you know, if this is actually true, then other Black students would discourage their peers from achieving. So they set out to test this, okay? So I'm not going to go through this particular slide, but even former President Barack Obama, you know, at the 2004 Democratic National Convention was quoted as saying, go into any inner city neighborhood and folks will tell you parents need to parent, that children can't learn unless we raise their expectations, turn off the television, and as he said, eradicate the slander that says a Black youth with a book is acting white. This same idea is further, you know, perpetuated. This is a quote from Clyde Haberman from the New York Times, and he says that, you know, there's this inescapable reality that if you are, you know, looking at books or studying or whatever, that you're acting white, and therefore you have this sort of anti-education mindset that is really perpetuated throughout the culture. However, they found that there really is limited evidence that supports this idea, that when you look at holistically and you really get into the data and the research, African American students are no less engaged in school than their white peers. And as you can see, this has been proven across multiple researchers and multiple studies. Also, Black students want to attend college at the same rate. They spend about the same amount of time on homework and have similar rates of absenteeism when compared to white students. But here's the key factor: of the same social class. So social class and economics seems to be a bigger driver than race when it comes to whether or not students want to be achieved. And high-achieving African-American students are often among the most popular students within a school. So again, this whole theory of students, you know, don't do well in school, their achievement gap exists because of this whole acting white or oppositional culture theory has been disproven pretty soundly. And also, too, that some recent research find a little bit of support, but it's really more in racially integrated schools when you see a lot of racialized tracking. And we can talk more about that here in a few minutes. So let's look at the demographics of the Riverview School where they did the case study. So you can see that the very large school, 3,164 students, and you can see the breakdown by race, both of the students, but also the teachers, 225 teachers. So again, we're talking about a very large, fairly diverse school overall. So let's look as well at the graduation rate. So one of the things they found that the group of students with the highest graduation rate was our white students. It's also notable that when you're comparing across groups, that Riverview did much better than other schools in similar metropolitan areas or urban schools. And they also beat pretty significantly, except in one category, the Asian and Pacific Islander, the state averages. But again, you will notice there is a gap between the various racial groups. So we have 96.6% of whites graduating, but only 70.8% of Hispanics. So that's a huge gap, you know, upwards of 26 points. So, you know, I think it begs to really look a little deeper into Riverview and what's going on and why you have such a significant difference between, you know, various groups when it comes to graduation. So the same thing too, they also looked at composite ACT scores. And again, you know, Riverview is doing much better, or, you know, at least somewhat better compared to our national averages. But again, you've got these huge differences between the various groups. So, you know, white students, their composite ACT score was 26.5. Compare that to an 18.2 score on ACT for African American students. So again, we're seeing, you know, an 8+ point gap between various groups. So the gap is certainly there. Now the real question is, how do we go about addressing this? So when they, you know, like I said earlier, they talked about, was it the oppositional culture and acting white? But in order for this to explain the gap, you have to make sure that the teasing or peer pressure. So let's say, you know, your belief system is that these gaps are existing because of this whole oppositional culture theory. But in order for that to be true, the teasing or the peer pressure that students are feeling from their own peers has to be race specific, it has to be pervasive, and it has to be linked to achievement related behaviors. If those three conditions do not exist, then, you know, the oppositional theory does not apply. I am so sorry. Here we go again. Let's do this one more time. Okay, so when they looked at these dynamics with Riverview High School, so they interviewed both staff and students, what they found was that all students across the GPA continuum want to do well and have educational aspirations that extend beyond high school. So right there, they found immediately that a lot of those stereotypes that people perpetuate and believe really are not true, that it does not matter what racial group a student's in, they all want to do well in school. They all want to go on to higher education or, you know, trade school or vocation or whatever. So, as one student was quoted as saying, nowadays you can't do nothing without going to college. So clearly the students understand the importance of education beyond high school, but we still have these gaps in their achievement. So most Black students do recognize that racism is there and it will make their efforts to succeed more difficult, but it also does not negatively impact their school engagement. They still will be engaged in school. They will still have those great educational aspirations. So the whole theory is that it really does not impact the students. And you can, I'm not going to read all these quotes to you, but you know, Keisha, who's one of the Black students, said, you know, we probably have to work harder to be whatever they want to be, but, you know, they students still aspire to higher results, okay? So, most people report that the idea of acting white is not a big issue at Riverview. There is some negative peer pressure, but it's mostly non-racial in nature, and we'll get more into this in a minute. But students and staff, that the negative peer pressure is often because students feel bad for not doing well themselves. So it's not so much the idea of we're disengaging, we're trying to pressure students, you know, across the spectrum into not acting white. It really has to do more with internal. Okay, so one of the things that they looked at, so Paul, he was given an example of non-racial teasing. And he says, Paul, he gets teased about it. He's on the baseball team, so he gets heckled a lot, you know, at practice. And the interview asked, because he gets good grades? And Paul's like, no, everybody gets good grades. It's like the way he talks. He's like he's like a smart aleck. You know, he'll memorize his stats. He always talks about them, and nobody wants to hear it. So, you know, it's just like, shut up. So, you know, this is really more about a personality kind of issue than it is racial, okay? So, if you fit the stereotype, glasses, you know, suspenders and a calculator in your hand, then you might get some teasing, okay? So, again, just another interview, which you can read, okay? So here are the percentages when they surveyed the students, and they said, you know, my friends make fun of people who try to do well in school. 13% of our Blacks said yes, 18%, a little bit higher for our Black students, actually highest for the Asian students, and you can go through. And you'll notice percent of friends who think that it's very important to study hard and get their grades. actually, the highest percentage comes from our Black students, and then we have ties for our white, our Asian, and and then you'll see it's a little bit lower for our Hispanic and mixed race students, but not anything statistically significant. Okay? So overall, we know students do value high achievement. They want it for themselves. Teasing tends to be non-racial, and it's usually directed to low achievers as well as high achievers, so there's not that discrimination. Teasing of high achievers does not seem to be that oppositional theory as much as it is about students feeling bad about their own performance. So there was little support to prove up the idea that the reason the achievement gaps exist is that oppositional culture theory. So let's go a little deeper. So what might account for that achievement gap? So part of this study also looked at institutional discrimination. So it looked specifically at practices and structures, how students are tracked education or academically, discipline application. Also to, what kind of cultural capital was available in the school, what was social networking like, and what were those everyday interpersonal things that affected it. So one of the things that seemed to be a very strong driver of how the institution handled things was actual and anticipated parent intervention. So one of the teachers is quoted here as saying, "I know that you're going to call me every day, so I'm going to advocate for that kid." Certainly as a former principal, as a former teacher, I had some high maintenance parents that I knew, gosh, I was going to hear about everything with their kid. So the question in the study becomes, when you have very highly involved parents, does that change outcomes for kids, not only academically, socially, and emotionally, but more importantly, is there a discriminatory element that plays into the way that student's treated and the way that they are actually educated? And then finally, how does that lead into their achievement and whether or not gaps exist? Okay? So, performance expectations and status hierarchies. So if we think about those socially significant characteristics as well as social rewards and behavioral patterns that tend to happen, you pull all that together and it forms a performance expectation. So for example, our made-up student Amber. So Amber, one of the things that's significant about her is that she comes from a highly educated family. Her dad is a college professor. Her mom is a doctor. So once teachers know that, whether they mean to or not, it will impact their belief system about this child because of what the parents have achieved. What are the social rewards? Well, you might be able to see this student interact and how that student may be rewarded by peers as well as by other teachers. So all of that pulls together and gives us an unconscious bias as teachers and educators about performance expectations. So we would expect, Amber to do pretty well in school. And then when we do that, it oftentimes creates behavioral inequalities and status hierarchies that we may not even realize that we're building within the way we interact with children and students, okay? So the other part of this too is when you look at academic tracking. Now, hopefully we've gotten a little bit smarter over the years and we're not doing this anymore, but I will tell you, I know it was a huge fight as a high school principal because when I got there, we had a regular on grade level classes, then we had honors classes, and then we had AP classes. So we noticed these patterns beginning to happen, that the majority of our white or more affluent students were in AP. A lesser, smaller group, maybe of our more middle class kind of students were in honors, and then everybody else fell over here in regular. So what we did was we reversed this, and we believed in AP for all. Because we realized that this tracking system was just perpetuating and moving forward those stereotypes that were not true and really were not helping us to close those achievement gaps. Okay? So As one student said, Riverview is two schools in one, the honors white school, and then there's the other school. Unfortunately, I've seen that way too often in too many school systems, and particularly in urban centers. You know, that the more Black kids are in the minority classes, and, you know, white kids are in the honors classes. And notice the students don't have any data, but they certainly see what's going on and are pretty astute, okay? So, this is kind of the reverse idea. So this student says, I'm white, so I'm expected to be smarter. Usually when someone sees me, they think I'm smarter than most people. And unfortunately, this student is well aware of those perceptions regarding other racial groups, that Black students are dumber than white and Hispanics are not as smart. So when you have a really smart Black person, you know, it feels weird. It feels incongruent with what this particular student is expecting, experiencing, and being socialized to believe. So again, I'm not going to read all these quotes to you. You know, you can go back and read them. Okay? So if a new kid comes in class and they're any other race, students will say, you don't belong here. This is the Black class. You know, and as much as that breaks my heart, you know, unfortunately that does still happen. You know, we also see a very much higher representation of Black students in special education. And that's specifically what this particular student is talking about. You know, that there just seems to be these inequalities in how students are placed into classes. Okay. Now, notice too the contrasting opinions or thoughts behind a teacher and an administrator. You know, so this teacher's concerned about what do they do with their regular ability students. And according to the associate principal, every class should be challenging and help your students to learn and grow. But unfortunately, that's not the case. It's students who are in the regular track classes oftentimes get a dumbed down curriculum with certainly less rigor and certainly less engagement, okay? The other thing that we notice are racial disparities in school discipline. So this has been proven over and over, actually all the way back to 1975 when they began studying this. And again, absolutely not anything that's probably surprising to us as educators, okay? The other piece of this too is that you have organizational routines which can perpetuate these stereotypes. So we have the ostensive, which is your official or ideal routine, and then the performative is actually what it looks like in practice, okay? So if you think about the ostensive aspect, so according to the theory or the belief, so a student breaks a school rule. The student goes through the discipline process and the student receives appropriate punishment. That's the way the policies are generally written. However, and you know, if we follow the guides, you notice here this gentleman states that, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, what your racial group is, you know, I'm gonna make sure that you follow the rules. Okay. But there's also the truth that some students are not treated the same ways. So if your parent can afford lawyers and they're very educated, they talk very loudly, you know, oftentimes those students are given a lighter or a different punishment than maybe students who don't have parents like that. You know, and so unfortunately we have this dual system going on. And in this instance, it's really more about socioeconomic status, education, and social status than it is maybe race, okay? The actual performative aspect of a discipline thing is that, you know, students' social status and staff responses shape their selection. So because Amber comes from an affluent family who can definitely afford lawyers and all of that, she may get a different treatment for a disciplinary infraction than a student who doesn't have access to those types of resources. And so whether we mean to or not, we're creating or perpetuating a system with biased outcomes, okay? So for example, students who leave the room during a period must get a pass, right? From a teacher or somebody else. Students without a pass face school consequences. That's the policy. But let's look at it at the application level. So this one particular student said, and notice this is a white student who even notices, she's able to notice and really discuss the disparities that occur. So security guards tend to point African Americans a lot more than whites. You know, I can walk down the hall without a pass, they just let me go. But if you have another student walking down the hall, they seem to pinpoint them and, you know, give them a punishment. But as a student believes, you know, I think really you need to stop everybody or don't stop anybody. But let's be fair and equitable in our treatment. Okay? So one of the things that I know as a high school principal we struggle all the time with, of course, is dress code. So here's the official code. And here's what actually one of the teachers says happens. So we have a policy that a girl couldn't have your belly showing. So all you saw walking the hall was girls with their white bellies out. Black girls are sent home. The black girls are upset about it. Well, why are you saying something to me? I'm sitting here in a room with 6 white girls with their stomach out, and you pick me out of the entire group. So again, very clear bias is occurring. Okay? And again, just some examples of that differential processing based on social status and other indicators, okay? So we know that when we set up, either intentionally or unintentionally, that differential selection process, and we don't apply all rules or all procedures equitably and fairly across all student groups, there are consequences. And what happens is our students become less engaged in school, and they don't really understand, and that we're not helping them to develop what they need to regarding race, justice, and fairness. So what did this study basically tell us overall? How are we going to change this so that there is not this disparity and that everyone feels a valued part of the school? And this ultimately can lead to closing a lot of those achievement gaps, particularly the underperformance we see in some of our urban schools and urban school systems. So we need a better focus on practices and dynamics rather than on family values or individual attitudes. It's really more about the way we handle the culture, and I don't mean racial culture, I mean school culture within our school systems. That we have to recognize that we have everyday discrimination is both prevalent and consequential. But it's really hard to explore and to delve deep into this because there's a lot of defensiveness, and people just want to pretend that it's not that way, so they don't really have open, honest conversations. And that we have to make sure that race continues to matter, and that if we really get this right, the hard work is what's going to be valued, and it's not going to be based in people's race or abilities. We also have to understand that we have some micro-level processes and practices that reinforce inequality. So we have to be aware of that, and that we have to point it out, and we have to be very honest about how we deal with it. We also have to change our policies and practices to ensure that we are being fair across groups. And that we, have to understand that, just because we've got a group of very aggressive white parents who want to hoard opportunities, that's not really the way that our school needs to function, that we're going to value everybody no matter what they bring to the table. And that we build in that structural competency so people have the skill set to handle some of these really difficult and challenging issues. Okay, so let me get back over here and see if I can get this to work. Stop. Hang on, guys, sorry. I don't know why my little screen's not working like it should. Oh, I just made everybody go away but me. Hang on, sorry. What have I done? What have I done? Where is it? So sorry, guys. Let me try this other way. Hi. Okay, well, here we go. Okay, now maybe I can see y'all. Okay, there we are. Hey, Kirsten, thanks for joining us. So, do you guys have any questions about what we talked about, or about any upcoming assignments or anything like that that I can help you with?
Not currently. I've just been reading a lot of the readings and taking notes.
Yeah, that's exact. Yeah, it sounds like you're very much on track. That's what you need to be doing. So yeah, we're going to start getting really more deeply into this and actually looking at some things and using, hopefully this data from your schools to look at, where does disparities exist and then to really break it down and identify, is this something that's a process or a procedure? Is it part of that differential that we have unknowingly created? So that we can make sure that, whatever plans we come up with are not going to perpetuate this cycle, but is actually going to break it so that the things that matter are going to be the focus for all students.
Excuse me, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah.
It's Kirsten. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Kirsten?
Wonderful. Thank you. I apologize. It was going in and out, so I missed the question and the beginning of your response. So if you wouldn't mind repeating what you just said, please.
Oh, yeah. I just said that, one of the things that we're going to get into actually starting next week is how do we create plans and systems and procedures that doesn't perpetuate this cycle, this sort of undercurrent of racial inequality that nobody talks about, nobody really deals with, but to look specifically at data and to close those gaps by creating a system that is fair for all students. And whatever we decide to do is going to be equitable and, really kind of push students forward. So, like I said, we'll get a little bit deeper into that work next week. And hopefully we'll be able to use some of the data from you guys at schools or school systems. If not, Lord knows I've got plenty of data we can look at.
Okay, awesome.
Okay.
I've been looking. I did a little research after your response this morning.
Yeah.
In regards to information from my district.
Yes, ma'am.
I wasn't able to find exactly what the template was asking for, but I was able to pull some information from our state Department of Education website. So I wanted to make sure that would be okay if I wasn't able to fill everything in, but
yeah, of course. Some districts and parishes and schools are really data rich, some are not. Just anywhere you can't find the data, just type in that block or put in there no data available or just, unavailable or something like that, just so I know you didn't just skip it. Does that make sense?
okay. Yes, ma'am. Gotcha.
Yeah. And that's part of, too, what we want to talk, really has some major implications for urban school reform. If you're going to close achievement gaps and you're really going to get down to the nitty gritty with this, you got to have data. And if you're working in a system that doesn't have a lot of data available, then that becomes a whole nother issue.
Gotcha.
Okay.
There's one more thing. I did the assessment last night.
Uh-huh.
And I have to say that I wasn't really sure how to engage with it. I know that was like our opportunity to just kind of understand where we fit as far as our bias is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
I could tell that there was a lot of focus on the Jewish,
Yes.
I guess my perspective about those from the Jewish culture.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. And I don't know. I guess I was trying to understand exactly what why they were coming from that perspective with their assessment.
Well, anytime you do an assessment that's part of a research project, one of the things they don't tell you is what their hypothesis is, because they don't want to sway results. A lot of times if they tell you, here's what we're testing for, then it will subconsciously skew people's responses.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I will tell you what they're looking at overall. This is actually a study out of Harvard, and I haven't participated with the group doing this, but I do know some of the researchers, not well, but I've done some work with them in the past. What they're really looking at is what are those internal biases that even the most, what's the word I'm looking for? The most self-aware person may not realize exists within them. And I will tell you, I took the assessment too. And at the end, I'm kind of like, really? I don't think that's true at all. I don't think
Yeah.
anybody say that. But that it did cause me to stop and think, like,
Mhm.
wow, do I have that bias? And I'm not. I thought I was pretty self-aware. I've worked in urban systems and with minorities my entire life,
Mhm.
I just found it somewhat surprising that they said I had a slight bias towards older white women. Well, I'm an older white woman, so maybe it's true. But for me, it was just more that kind of self-examination. But yeah, they're trying to figure out for people who, like I said, are pretty self-aware, if there may still be elements of bias that we just don't see.
Gotcha.
Okay. Anything else, ladies, tonight? Well, I'm going to turn off the recording. So